Our next video is continuing on to talk about percentages and just talking a little bit about the ways in which people use percentages that can be confusing, that can be misleading, um, that can be just flat out wrong, okay? Because this is one of the things that you're going to be looking at. So, how can we use percentages in a way that is clear, and how do people use percentages in ways that aren't necessarily clear, okay? So let me give you an example, and we'll talk kind of a little bit about why I wanted to put up this particular example. So say that somebody said that um, the cost of owning a car is, say, 650% the cost of using public transportation, and somebody else said the cost of a public transit pass is 30% more than I spend on gas. Each month, say, something like this. Okay? So these are two claims. One person is arguing that having a car and using that instead of public transportation is much more expensive than having a car is much more expensive than public transportation. The other person is arguing that public transportation is more expensive than having a car. Okay? So how could these statements both be correct? Is one question, and in fact they could. And how? Which is more expensive, having a car or public transportation? Right? Neither of these are giving you the full picture, right? So they're comparing different things, and this is going back to the last lecture when we were talking about percentages. The most important thing you can think of is, what is this a percentage of? Okay? What are we taking a percentage of? Here, what does it mean, the cost of using public transportation? The cost of owning a car? It's not really clearly defined. And so you have to dig in and say, okay, well, what do they mean by that? What is the cost of owning a car? What are they including in that? Are they including insurance, car payments, gas? Maybe if you live in some cities, it can cost more because you have to pay for a parking spot, right? Depending on where you live. What is included exactly in that? What does it mean, the cost of owning a car? The second one, though, is just comparing the cost of a public transit pass to the amount that you spend on gas. Okay? And again, maybe even here there's a little bit of kind of a disconnect, right? Because how much do you spend on gas depends on how much you drive, what kind of car you have. But again, the important thing here to recognize is that these are percentages of different things. And so you can't compare them directly. And so anytime you see something like this, where somebody's using percentages or quantitative information, you need to think, percentage of what? What are they talking about? And what exactly, right? So when you say 650% the cost of owning a car, what does that include? And a good article or a good story or a good textbook will be very clear what they're talking about. They'll either use a term that is very well defined, right? They might say the cost of a public transit pass in Baltimore City, right? A monthly public transit pass. They're going to be either precise about it, or if they're vague, then they're trying to oversimplify things, and you really need to dig deeper and understand what it is exactly they're talking about. Let me give you another example of this, something that is kind of a very famous example. Let's see, I have these numbers here somewhere. Okay, so this was a statement that a lot of people have heard before. And so if you've heard anything about drug policy in the United States, you may have heard somebody say that marijuana is a gateway drug. Okay, and the idea here being that people who use marijuana go on to use other drugs later in life. Okay, And so where this comes from, this is false, by the way, but I'll get to that in a minute. Where this comes from is from a statistic that got misinterpreted. Okay? So I think this was in the 1960s or 1970s, someone claimed, and this is not correct, but the claim was that 80% of marijuana users go on to use hard drugs. Okay, whereby hard drugs is, I don't know, whatever. Hard drugs, we'll just leave it at that. I don't know exactly what they meant, and so I'm not going to say it, but something, whatever the particular study was looking at. This is not true. So the study did not actually find this. What was actually true is a very similar statement. So what's actually true is 80% of hard drug users first used marijuana. Okay? And so even though these statements look very, very similar, right? All I've done is I've switched kind of the order of things. Even though these are very similar, they mean very, very different things. So if you think about it, here we're talking about 80% of marijuana users. Marijuana use is very common. 80% of marijuana users would be a huge number of people. 80% of hard drug users, hard drugs, narcotics, things like that, much less common. And so 80% of narcotic users would be a much smaller percentage that first used marijuana, or a much smaller number. It's the same percentage, but a much smaller number because it's a percentage of a different thing, right? Here they're talking about 80% of marijuana users in the false claim, when in fact it was 80% of hard drug users first used marijuana, okay? And this may seem, these are very similar, right? You might say, oh, it's really easy to get these confused. But if you know anything about drug policy in the United States, a lot of drug policy in the United States was based on this idea that marijuana was a gateway drug. The marijuana legalization movement right now has been fighting against this. Part of the reason it took so long, part of the reason that so many people are in jail for marijuana possession, was because of this claim. And so one misinterpreted percentage has ruined a lot of people's lives. People who are incarcerated, people who've been persecuted for marijuana possession because of this belief that it was undermining society. So understanding quantitative information can be tremendously important, okay? And this is just a great example that you can see, okay?